So let's go on now to Dr. Lida Anestidou, and she's from the National Academy of Sciences on responsible conduct of science.
It's a lovely picture. We need to leave that up. It's really beautiful. So I wanted to thank you all for the kind invitation. In order for me to be able to sort of frame my thoughts, how does this work with this? Hold on. Okay. I was actually looking a lot at this picture from Dr. Esvelt's article. It's sort of brought home the messages for me multiple times, the fact that there are so many overlapping organisms that can be affected by these technologies, and that nowhere here are the humans present, yet we are the ones who are devising this technology to affect all these other things that are then going to in turn affect us. And oops, I'm sorry, this is, okay. So with this picture and the statement of task that is so multifaceted, that discusses risks and potential hazards and goes into dual use issues and so forth, I thought that my take-home message would be that in order to have a good method of control, I don't know who's going to be the guide and the judge of what a good method of control for these technologies can be. But if we actually teach people or try to teach scientists how to be responsible in what they do, maybe that would be a very good way that we can actually take care of many things, make people be thoughtful about what they do, make people understand that there are ways to do science well and responsibly and actually still be very successful in what you do. I think that is my recommendation, if I'm allowed to put this word in front of the panel. So I structured my few minutes by first giving you a little bit about some thoughts about responsible science, some words about it. Then I'm going to talk about some frameworks, most of which are relevant to responsible science and indirectly thus to some of the issues that are part of the statement of task. And then I will finish by coming back to education. So I took some of the material on my slides from a book that I think Angela may have distributed to the committee, which is this blue book. This was written in 2012 by a multinational committee that represented a number of science academies from different nations, from Africa, Latin America, Europe, and so forth. And in contrast to other books that have been written about what it means to be a responsible scientist, this book actually started by talking about the positive values that scientists carry with them and that carry us through the day. And so they're not unknown words, but they do, I think, describe some of the mechanisms that we have in place to make sure that what we do is really good. It's being accountable for the things we publish, being honest about the things we do, being open and transparent about how we do it and share that knowledge with others, create reproducible and reliable results that others can use to build on them, being fair to our peers, our students, and our colleagues, being objective and try to understand our biases. None of these things are new to people, but I think they're often lost, especially when we talk about misconduct and negative things. So I tried to put some words that are generally understood and connected to the concept of responsible conduct. And I came up with three groups. The first group is what I ended up calling global reference terms, simply because a lot of these words are understood by many scientists in many parts of the world. And my assumption in my presentation is that whatever you do will have impacts in, I think, the globe, simply because the technology is such, simply because science does not obey borders anymore. And so, and also because a lot of the things that come out of committees like this are actually looked up and copied very often in other parts of the world. So my assumption by putting these slides together is that I looked at things that I know from my work internationally. And so a lot of these words and a lot of these concepts are understood by many people. They're not understood in the same way, but they do speak to them. They may speak about problems, they may speak about things that do not exist in other cultures, but I think they encompass characteristics of science and research that are common across many nations and societies. Some things are contextual, so that means that people understand them differently based on the culture that they come from. So there are parts of the world where biopiracy is a very big thing for them, and they do view this as being an issue of irresponsibility or responsibility of science, depending on whose viewpoint you get. And there are parts of the world where guest authorship is a sign of respect to a someone who has been there before you, somebody who is the leader in a laboratory, and so forth. We do not aspire in the West to the same thing, but there are parts of the world where that is important. And so the context plays a role in the way we understand these concepts. And lastly, this last piece is I think, a dichotomy that people do because of the pre-existing regulatory frameworks when one works with laboratory animals or with human participants. And of late, I think one can put there research that can be misused, research with dual use potential and so forth. That should not really mean that when you work with animals or when you work with humans, you are shouldn't be following responsible conduct in your science. No, but people set them apart because they say, well, you have regulations for them, we don't need to worry. And that is something that I thought was, it's important to mention. I also wanted to give you some definitions about research misconduct, not because I'm going to explain what falsification is and so forth, but because there are different understandings and different explanations of the same terms in different parts of the world. It is true that the US, I think, was the first one that came up with the definition, and there is also a punitive aspect to our definition. But as you can see from just the two examples I put on here, Finland, for example, splits misconduct, good grief, splits misconduct into different ways, whereas fraud for us is something that is associated with monetary problems and financial sort of misbehaviors from researchers. In Australia, conflict of interest is part of what they consider to be misconduct. So again, the same terms mean different things perhaps, or a little bit different depending on the context of where one works and speaks. I'm going to move on now to mention some regulatory frameworks that you may or may not want to consider. Of course, the Cartagena Protocol is very integral to the things that you do. I put it there simply because it's an international treaty that has 170, I think, signatories, and the US is not one of them. And I don't know how this can play within a statement of work where the term responsible science is looming so large. I think it's something that is important to consider. OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, in 2007 came up with a framework of best practices. So that is another international place you can look at, with the caveat that OECD's member states, 34 or so, are all developed countries, and that does carry into how people see and view best practices in any context. So that's another little caveat that might affect the way these things have been written. Lastly, in terms of frameworks, I wanted to bring up words that are becoming more and more prevalent in our daily conversations. The word biosecurity, which was recently the subject of a global conference by the World Animal Health Organization. I mean, by recently, I mean a month ago, less than a month ago. And under the term biosecurity, you find words that are threatening in different cultures. We have come across researchers from the Middle East, for example, where the word biosecurity is anathema to them because it brings up ideas of a police state and of interference with their personal freedom. So depending again where one is, the words get different meanings. So, and with respect to research with dual use potential, I put it up there because I wanted to contrast what the policy from the US government is and what some things that happen in the way, for example, grant applications are evaluated at the level of the European Commission and the European Research Council. So whereas the US government policy focuses on select agents and toxins on the list and experiments that relate to them, in the EU, it's a broader framework that includes other types of research. Not necessarily research that applies to the gene drives. It's just a different way of thinking about how a scientist that puts together a research proposal has to defend the research proposal according to any of these different things that might be misused as this technology is being developed. Okay, so this is where now I will turn all of this back into education, and I would like to defend the statement that I made in the beginning. I took this from the executive summary from this OIE conference about biosecurity, and I signaled out the words in red because they refer very much to the points that I want to make. They talk about the responsible science as being part of education curricula, ethics as being something that can help develop common understandings across nations, and OIE's member states are 193. They span the whole globe, from the most developed to the least developed. So these words carry some meaning across continents and across nations. And from this blue book that you all have, I took a couple of quotes, one for research institutions that need to embrace and allow for education and training to be part of how science happens within their laboratories, and similar kind of recommendation for funding agencies about, again, education and training. Now, none of this is new to this group, obviously, but we've always taken the education in responsible science to be part of the mandate that we need to fulfill when we're applying for grants from funding agencies. And that can be equivalent to compliance rather than being actually something meaningful, something that speaks to the values that we bring to the lab when we decide to become scientists, something that makes us actually proud of the work that we do, rather than being equivalent to filling out forms and spending half of our times doing paperwork. So that's why I emphasize education, in the hope that it will mean for you something that is aspirational in many ways, rather than part, again, of the compliance culture. And lastly, because also I think that in order for a scientist to be an engaging component of society, something that I think we have a responsibility to be, education in a broader sense is really critical. So we do science because we have a mandate from society and we have trust from society, but we also have their funds to do that. And so I think we have a responsibility to engage them in an equal way. I was struck by the fact that your last slide had the words informed consent on it, because after I finished putting this slide together, it struck me that all the things I wrote here are pretty much the same things that the physicians go through when they try to recruit human participants for their work. Only there, you're able to explain to the participant the risks and the benefits, and they sign the informed consent, and then they become voluntary subjects to this process. Here, the public, of course, cannot do that, but actually new technologies and the way when we ask their permission to move forward with them without completely knowing the risk, with doing uncertain work in many ways, we have to be able to treat the public with the same kind of reverence, if you will, that the human subjects research protections were put in place so many decades ago. And so I will leave you with that. I put together a small slide with take-home points, which are, repetitions from things that I already went through. And so I will stop here. I hope I didn't abuse my time. And I thank you very much for the opportunity to address you.
Wonderful, thanks very, very much. 2 bits of housekeeping just for a moment. For those interested